Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'll be analyzing the Kherson counteroffensive, how the situation has changed since my last analysis of it, and what will happen further on. So, looking back at how I drew defensive lines over the past about 3 weeks ago, the situation has changed. As we all know, the Ukrainians have made a push and have gone around the Russian defensive lines and pushed onwards. So, as we know, the way the Ukrainians pushed and captured this territory was by pushing here in the east, straight down all the way to Dujami very quickly, and forcing the Russians to fall back from these positions that they had held in the north, and putting them back to this new defensive line, which we see down here in the south. So the way we see the defensive lines changing is that this line here that they pulled back from defensive grid was holding this line for as long as possible while these forces withdrew first. So what we saw was that the VDV, which was holding this first defensive line, was the first to pull back, and they were going down this road and then inside towards Borosenske, which allowed them to go away from the Ukrainian front line here in the west. So the way that they pulled back was little by little as they went by, and then the Ukrainians took advantage of that situation to then pull their forces towards this area and allowing them to set up new offensive positions towards the Russian occupied territory. After which they connected these forces and are now holding this defensive line to the east. This area is still open as these villages are completely destroyed from all the fighting that has happened, and most likely they are holding this defensive line so that if the Ukrainians manage to advance into it, it'll be a trap for them to shoot down on them rather than actually fighting them head on, which is why the Ukrainians are not advancing in this area. Then looking further east, we see that they have now established this new defensive line here, which they have established with the withdrawn soldiers. As for the central area, they were slowly pulling back here in the center towards Porosenske as well, after which we see that these were actually slower at withdrawing, and that is because there's no actual road. They had to go through these open fields, which in this autumn with how we are in the fall, it is very difficult for them to pass through the open fields rather than a road, which forced them to go slower, which is why we saw the Ukrainians actually caught them around Pyatiretsky, and some fighting ensued in this village before they actually pulled back to Borosenske, and now they have created this defensive line to the east towards Mylov, connecting Borosenske with Sukhanove and Mylov. So this is the new Russian defensive line. It has no gaps. So this Russian new defensive line has actually without gaps, unlike what we saw here to the north, which cost them about 30 to 40 kilometers in the length of this territory, as well as forcing them to fall back and possibly leaving behind a lot of equipment, as well as leaving some men behind, as it was a forced withdrawal at a very high speed. So the situation now is that the Ukrainians are trying to focus their forces around this defensive line we see here, this triangle here, which will force the Russians to pull back further or allow the Ukrainians to actually encircle these forces here in the north by pushing through this area here, after which they can push southwards through this defensive line, completely ignoring these two lines of defense. This will allow the Ukrainians to move on to Novakhovka, which is the target of this northern operation, allowing them to either cross through the Dnieper River or generally just force the Russians to fall back towards the Inulets River and focusing all the forces in the Kherson region, allowing the Ukrainians to focus their forces in one area instead of splitting them into two, which allows them to make a siege on the Kherson city and completely take control of the western part of the Kherson region. As for the western part of the Kherson region, we see that the first defensive line is still holding, as we see this line here has still not been breached. However, there are a lot of reports that the Ukrainians are amassing large contingents of troops here in the central area, and this is most likely to push through, as I said in my earlier video, into this area between the first and second lines of defense, cutting off the Russian forces here in the north and allowing the Ukrainians to encircle these forces and take control of the area all the way to the Innerlets River. By taking control of this area, it will actually give them an opportunity to push through this Innerlets River bank and allow them to go around the Russian defensive line with a offensive that is coupled here in the central area, which is a trap by the Russians, will turn into a trap by the Ukrainians, and they will be able to cut off the Russian defensive line. This will force the Russians here to either withdraw or get encircled, which will allow the Ukrainians to pass through this area as well and going around the Russian defensive lines. So there's a lot of options for the Ukrainians, and it depends on how they play it out. Once they have captured this northern area, they can relocate their forces and focus in the southern one, where they can go around Oleksandrivka, which the Russians are still holding because there's this reservoir here, which is difficult to cross through because the only point of crossing is the dam, which is here to the south, or this open field to the north, which makes it difficult for them to cross. So they are holding the line rather than pushing. The situation is that the Ukrainians have the opportunity to push through here in the south as well as in the east, collapsing the first Russian defensive line and possibly engaging into the eastern part, or just pushing southwards, as this village, as the city here in the north, which is Shihorivka, is actually a very tough Russian stronghold as well as supply hub, which allows them to operate here in the north. By cutting it off rather than engaging into it, it will allow them to encircle the forces here as well as go around it rather than pushing through it, which would cause a lot of casualties as it is heavily defended. Now, focusing on the city itself, once they have collapsed these first defensive line and possibly gone through here, then there's two options. Will they push through from the east with the collaboration from the north, or that is only possible if they actually cross the river and take control of the eastern part, or will they try to push through this weak spot here around Russia? And I say this is a weak spot because if the Ukrainians hold the line here in the north as well as in the west, there's only a short distance here between the coast and the defensive line. If they push through this highway and take control of it, they will be able to cut off all the Russian forces here in the west. However, if the Ukrainians manage to push through this first defensive line, I expect the Russians to actually fall back from this position, as it would be vulnerable, and hold the defensive line here by this gap here and following it up with the second line of defense, which would force the Ukrainians to push through the highways, which will allow them to connect here outside the city by going around the Kherson airport, which will cut off these forces here in the north and in the south, but also allow the Ukrainians to reach the third line of defense surrounding Kherson. So after they take control of this western part, to take control of the eastern part, they would need to push through this highway as well. And once they've controlled all highways, the Russians will naturally fall back to this siege of the city. Now, a siege operates as a siege. The Ukrainians will surround the city and they will bombard it and try to starve out the Russian soldiers from their ammunition, from their foods, from their supplies, and force them to surrender rather than storming the city. Storming the city would be very suicidal as it is a large city, and 10,000 Russian defenders in this large city will prove very difficult for the Ukrainians. We saw how the 20,000 Ukrainian Azov defenders in Mariupol managed to hold out for more than 3 months. But generally speaking, Kherson would stand for at the very least a couple of months, which will allow the Russians to gather enough forces from the partial mobilization to force the Ukrainians to focus their troops elsewhere. However, with an encirclement of the city, the Ukrainians are able to focus a smaller part of their forces in this Kherson region rather than what large force that they're focusing now. So generally speaking, an encirclement and siege of the Kherson city is very beneficial for the Ukrainians, as it allows them to move their troops elsewhere and focus on the situation on the general front. So that's going to be it for this analysis. Thanks for watching and have a great day.